So, I live in San Juan County on the Utah side. I was with some friends and we wanted to party, and my friend said her boyfriend had alcohol, so we went to his house. We ended up in this place on the res, in the middle of nowhere, by a shack, and found him and his dog asleep in a ditch. The first thing I notice is that there are bones everywhere. Next, the dog got up, but it got up really creepily. I've never been afraid of any dog ever, but the way this one got up gave me the chills. It was super skinny looking and looked like it had mange because its fur was patchy and its skin looked leathery. Its eyes looked human, and it kept balancing on the back of its legs while crouched over. The whites of his eyes were also red, while the irises were a light brown. Next, the guy got up. He was really sketchy. At first, we just thought he was a drunk, but he was acting incredibly strange. As soon as he got in the car, it reeked like actual death. Like he smelled rotten and foul. We had to roll the windows down. He was wearing baggy clothing and 4 different jackets. We'll call him B. He was talking incoherently and kept yawning while he talked, but he seemed to walk mostly normal, except he had a weird limp that made him sway with every step. Turned out he didn't have any drinks, but we had already gotten him, so we went to go get another friend that we knew. So, we pick up this friend. We'll call him A. A has alcohol, but we have nowhere to party, so B says he knows a spot. We proceed to let B guide us back to the res and to a really sketchy trailer a few miles away where we initially picked him up at. The dog is there, waiting for us. At this point, I just wanted to go home because the whole scenario was giving me awful vibes, and everything in my body was telling me I needed to leave. I'm not a superstitious person at all either, but B's girlfriend was my ride home, so I had no other choice. I decided at that moment that I wasn't going to drink or do drugs with them because of the circumstances. We get out of the car, and the creepy dog comes straight towards me and knocks me down and starts trying to hunt me. B got the dog off me immediately though, and I ran into the abandoned trailer camper. Some of the windows were broken and everything was old and dusty. The carpet was torn up and there was no furniture except for some lawn chairs. I took a seat, and I hear B whisper to A that he has some spice. My 3 other friends get into the trailer with me and start taking shots of alcohol that A brought. B whips out a bowl to smoke something. My friend asks what it is, and he says it's weed. They start smoking, and it doesn't smell like weed at all. I look at it under the flashlight and realize it is indeed spice, and try telling them that it's not weed and that we should probably leave. They make fun of me and take more shots and more hits. I look out the window and see the creepy dog crawling and running around the trailer. A, at this point, is pretty drunk and starts yelling at B for killing his dad a few days prior. B gets flustered and leaves with his girlfriend. A few minutes later, the dog tries to open the door with its paws. It doesn't succeed, but I could see it trying since the door had a window. I got really scared because this dog was not normal and was just staring at me through the glass. I start sharing my location with a few people in case something wrong happens. A is crying about how B murdered his dad on the res and that he can't bring himself to forgive B for what he's done. They are apparently close cousins. I just wanted to go home. B returns with his girlfriend and a fight breaks out, so we all leave B and his dog at the trailer. Then, B's girlfriend randomly has a psychotic episode as we get back to town and decides she wants everybody else in the car to walk home. She screams at them to get out, and they all walk for over a mile to get to their homes. She drops me off for some reason, without saying a word. When I get home, I check my phone to find that my friends were scared because something kept throwing rocks at them on their way back. Anyway, I'm literally convinced this was an experience with a skinwalker, or something. Everything there was Navajo, except me, if that makes a difference. I know it's cheesy in writing, but it was actually really scary, and I was crying on the way back home. I don't know how to describe the dog and the way it walked, but it wasn't normal. Anyway, I might just be paranoid, but everything about the situation was honestly just so scary and weird that I felt like I needed to share it with somebody and see what their thoughts were. I've been terrified and haven't been able to sleep because if it wasn't a skinwalker, it was a murderer who probably hadn't showered since the murder, that had a creepy dog that tried to drug us. What do you think? So, I had this experience that happened when I was about 8 or 9 with my parents. Every time I think of the story, talk about it, try to tell someone, I literally get goosebumps and my eyes water. Even typing this, I have goosebumps and my eyes are watering. I have accidentally found this and I have the same goosebumps again. I do believe what I saw as a child was a skinwalker, and now I'm incredibly frightened. Before I dive into my encounter, does anyone know any more information that's actually legit? As far as the story goes, I live on the East Coast of the United States. I was at a park with my mother and father when I was just a kid. I was playing on the playground, but the sun was going down, and my parents told me that we had to leave. So, we started to walk back to the parking lot. As we walked through this very heavily wooded park, me and my mother see something. We were in a more open, circular, green, grassy area, surrounded by total forest. We were on one side, and this thing came out from the woods on the other side. Pause. This is where I have to stop and take a breath, because as I write this, my eyes are watering, and I'm getting goosebumps. This is so hard to talk about. Back to the story. John, look at that over in the woods, my mother says to my father. I grabbed my mother's hand and asked her what it was. She just said in this really shaky voice, I don't know, but it's not normal. My dad proceeded to tell us that it is just a deer and to keep moving before we scare it. But then this creature looked at us. It wasn't super close, so all I could see was this white thing on all fours, with a head shaped like the dumb stereotypical aliens we see on TV. It was not something I had ever seen. After it noticed us 100%, it walked forward. Then it stood up on 2 legs and walked closer. Not like an animal anymore, but like a human. I still couldn't make out a face, and to this day can't. But it wasn't a deer. When it switched to 2 legs, it still looked like this white, oddly shaped thing. Again, kind of like a typical alien we see on TV. My mother and I stood in total shock, fear, and awe. We didn't move our bodies. The only thing that moved was our hands clasped, which grew tighter and tighter. My father, on the other hand, is a total disbeliever in anything supernatural or religious. So, him being totally fine was just standing watching what we thought was a deer. After this thing scared the living hell out of us and made our spines tingle, it turned around and ran back into the woods. First on 2 legs, then on all 4. My mother and I didn't speak about it until we got in the safety of our home back in the city, a good hour from this foresty park. But to this day, only me and my mother really remember what we saw and how bone-chilling it was. And as I said, I literally cannot talk about it or even write this without having to wipe my eyes, which just keep watering, and my nose, which keeps running. I can wipe away my tears and my snot, but the goosebumps remain. If you stuck and read through all of that, I appreciate it. It's something that still gives me the creeps today. Honestly, it's single-handedly the most terrifying otherworld type of experience I've ever had, which I only have one other. Here's some bonus information about me. I live on the East Coast. I'm a quarter Native American. My mother's father was full-blooded, and her mother was half. But her father was taken to one of those re-education schools back in the day. they would take Native American children, erase their culture, and make them essentially good white children. I have no clue if any of this is relevant. I just read that skinwalkers are a Native American thing. My dad is not Native at all. When I was a kid, I told other paranormal buffs on my school about this experience, and they said it sounded like the Jersey Devil, which apparently has been seen on the East Coast. I'm surprised that I'm running this out, because I'm not the type of person to ever show interest in this subject, but I believe I saw some sort of aquatic sea creature that is either unknown to man or is part human in a sense. Before I go on, I'll give you some background information on me. I'm a professional photographer. I do lots of work for larger clients, and even have some of my work featured in magazines. For that record, I'm going to keep my identity concealed, because if my name gets out, attached to this, it might ruin me. I can't risk that. I've spent far too many years building up my repertoire, so you can call me Ethan for short. Now, the time and place this event took was in 2016. I was visiting the chain of islands of Hawaii, doing some landscape photography of the coast and surrounding spots for a client that was working on a big project. I was out in the early morning hours on the beach of the southwestern side of Oahu. I was setting up to do some landscape shots of the ocean, getting my tripod just right, when to my left, I felt this weird sensation, like someone was looking at me. So I turned out of reaction, and I was astonished at what I saw. Standing out of the shallow water was a creature I can't begin to accurately describe to you. It was a bluish green, had scales covering the entire body, fins, was rather shorter and kind of stubby looking. It was standing there, about waist deep in the shallow water, just watching me set up my tripod. As soon as I noticed it, I yelled out of shock. It swiftly turned back toward the water and disappeared underneath the surface. It almost did like a belly flop, nose dive kind of thing. It was so fast I can't describe it. I have never seen a creature like this before in my life. It looked so human-like. I don't even have anything that comes to mind for me to give you a comparison, because there's nothing that looks like that. I didn't see its lower half, but it was very much so half man, half fish, or sea-like. It had a human-like face with black eyes. It didn't make any noise that I noticed. This thing was probably only about 20 feet away from me. I hadn't seen it because of the angle that I was facing setting up my equipment. Who knows how long it had been there, watching me. This happened during the early morning hours, just as the sun was rising, so I had a lot of visibility and clarity on what I saw. It was so smooth in its movements that after it disappeared back into the water, I tore down my equipment as fast as I could and changed locations for my shooting that day. The hardest part was creating an excuse as to why I couldn't shoot at that location, because my client wanted very specific pictures of that location that I was at. Luckily, I was able to create almost identical pictures at a different location without my client ever knowing. I was not going to go back to that spot at the beach. I don't know what was watching me, but it gave me the creeps. Had I known there's animals like that live in the water, I probably would have thought twice about going down to that spot on the beach. My work is ever going in my list of clients, and it doesn't stop. I have never had anything weird like that happen to me before, or since. With the 4th of July coming up, I have a very interesting tale for you that occurred about 4 or 5 years ago on the 4th of July. My father and I, and some other family and friends were boating out on a local lake. This is a rather large lake, and we were going around to the other side to find a better fishing spot. The time was about 1 p.m. in the afternoon. After we had found a good spot, we did some fishing. My dad booted up the motor again, and we went back to the original docking spot that we were at. Well, my dad noticed on the way back something. The rudder seemed to be acting weird. It wasn't fully functional like it was, and it was making a very odd smell, and sounded a bit weird. It would then have periods where it sounded functional again, or at least semi-functional. My father never thought much of it, but by the time we got to the end of the day and we were loading the boat back on the trailer out of the water, he saw the most horrific thing. Well, we all did. The reason the rudder had been making all those funky noises as we were on the boat, because something had gotten caught in the blade, jamming it partially when pulling on the engine and having it go multiple times. The rudder must have chopped up whatever this was, because its body was still partially stuck on the rudder. I don't know what it was, and I've never seen a fish like this. It had gills, but was very amphibian reptilian looking. It had a long body, black eyes, and a large gaping mouth with lots of sharp teeth. It was longer than my father, so probably about 8 feet in length. It wasn't an alligator gar, trust me. I know what those look like. Those are fish, and they definitely look like fish. This looked much more not fish-like, as I said. Very amphibious and reptilian looking. From what I saw, it kind of reminded me of a cross between a frog thing and an alligator, if that makes sense, but with a more eel-like body. It's really hard to describe. It doesn't help that it was pretty mutilated by the rudder blades of the boat, so what we were seeing was its partial body. It had arms though, whatever it was, and it looked like they were clung onto the rudder. It's like it was clung onto the bottom of the boat, right as he started up the engine, would be my guess. It was so freaky. Freaked my dad out, because he's done so much fishing. He ain't ever seen anything like that. My whole family saw it. Tried to convince him it was a sturgeon, but please, sturgeon don't look anything like this did. It was dark green and had patches of black on it. Very bizarre. I didn't take a picture, but I wish I would have. The head was still intact, partially, but its face was torn off, at least half of it, from the blade. Whatever it was large. I forgot to mention more about its face. It had a very short protruding mouth. Not quite a snout, but very reptile-like, I thought, or that's the way it looked. The teeth were sharp and in great numbers, but they too looked more reptile-like than fish. Fish teeth are sharp, but these resembled shark teeth, kind of. It's hard to explain. You would have to have seen it to know what I meant. It took my dad about an hour or two to try and fully pry this thing off of his rudder, so it was completely disengaged. The more chunks of meat he ripped off his rudder, the nastier it was. Very clumpy looking meat. I've had alligator meat before, and it kind of reminded me of that. It's just one of those things that you look back on as something unexplainable. So, this story happened last summer. We have lawn parties every year at my mom's house on the lake. This particular one got pretty crazy, and I ended up real tipsy. But when I drink, I get hyped up, and everything just seems like a good idea. We all kept jokingly saying, "Yeah, we're all gonna go swimming later." As the night drew on, I was warm from running all over the place, so I said, "Okay, time to swim." Everyone laughed, but I was set on it. I probably had the most to drink that night, so no one else could be convinced. I didn't care though. Something about alcohol just makes you feel fearless, even though I knew there were eels around the lake at night, which would usually terrify me sober. I got to the wharf and slowly slipped into the water, and it was a great night to swim. They threw me a life jacket, just to be on the safe side. I just sat on in and grabbed my drink. I floated around laughing while they all snapped pictures of me. After a few minutes of fun, all of it wore off, and I was a little creeped out. So I got out, and we went on with the rest of the night, having a great time. The next morning, we cooked a big breakfast and talked about how fun the night was and how crazy I was for going out into the water. So goes the routine of looking through all the pictures of the night before and uploading them onto social media. Everyone was spread out between the kitchen, dining room, and living room, but the house seemed oddly quiet for how many people were there, and they all started handling their phones to one another, pointing at something. So right away, I was thinking, no way, they had some really embarrassing pictures of me. But nobody was laughing. I was confused. Then they handed me the phone and asked, "Do you see anything weird in this picture?" It didn't seem like anything at first, but then I saw it. It looked like figures of people standing around me while I floated there in the lake. I was kind of freaked out, but I thought it could just be fog. I'll look through the rest. I flipped to the next one and examined it. What I saw was in the picture. I zoomed in and looked for an excuse for it, but I can't explain it, and everybody else saw it too. It looked like a horned creature just emerging from the water right in front of me. I had the chills and am so creeped out just reliving this. I'll never swim in that lake again, especially at night. What happened to me 3 years ago is hard for me to tell you and talk about. It has traumatized me and has left me a different person, so I will try my best to calmly and carefully explain my situation. So here I go. 3 years ago, I was asked if I can come and stay at my friend's house for a couple of weeks, just to watch their animals for them while they left. This family was a family that I was very close with and had grown up with for a very long time. They lived on the outskirts of a smaller town out in Arizona and had some goats and some dogs and some other miscellaneous livestock, like chickens. They were going on a 2-week stint across the US somewhere, but I couldn't really bother to remember. It's kind of irrelevant. I was in between jobs at this time, pretty rinky-dink ones, and they were going to pay me a pretty penny for the 2 weeks that I was planning to stay out at their house. So, of course I accepted the offer. They live about an hour outside of a small town in Arizona that I can't remember the name of. I just know it's a couple of hours outside of Tucson, but they have their own piece of property with a small stable-like structure that they have built, and they house other livestock in. Goats primarily. Dogs and such, but they don't have any horses or cattle, which I guess is uncommon. To keep their names covered, I'll refer to them as Jack and Danielle. They were both in their later 30s. My family had grown up close with them for quite some time, until they moved outside of Tucson, to where I can only imagine that they still are today, if that is where they are. I'll explain that in a minute. They knew I was out of work and looking for a decent paycheck, so they offered me a 2-week job of looking after their house and their pets for a 2-week stay at their home. But my parents and I had to get me out there, so they bought me a Greyhound ticket. I was only 18 at the time. To my knowledge, Danielle could not conceive, so the only real children they had were their dogs and goats, which was fine by me. It meant less I had to babysit on top of what I was doing, and I figured I could use the time at their place to kind of just chill out and enjoy the hot weather, and de-stem from my life here. Little did I know it was going to turn into what it did. So, I got a ticket out there, and I met Jack in Tucson, where he picked me up from the bus stop. I grew up in Southern Cali, along with Jack and Danielle for most of my life, so I was already accustomed to the stifling heat. But I feel like Arizona brought a whole new level. On the car ride out there, he's explaining to me how beautiful it is and how I'm gonna have a great time for these next 2 weeks, and hopefully, I won't be too bored. Arriving on the property was the first real time I even got to see their house. It was much larger than I imagined it. Jack worked a very high-paying job, and Danielle operated a very successful at-home business making clothing, so they were not short for good money. They both took me on a mini tour of the property, where I was able to see their outside shed they built, and see a beautiful handcrafted stable that they made for their goats and dogs. Even though the dogs were so attached to Danielle and Jack, they never slept in it. They primarily slept inside. Hey, whatever, right? It was their fur babies after all. They had a total of 6 goats and 4 dogs and about a dozen chickens. They had a Labrador retriever named Missy. They had a black lab named Buddy. And then 2 blue heelers that were rescued were also sisters that came from the same puppy litter. Their names were Misha and Mega. The goats all had very similar names, kind of reminding me of the dwarfs in the Lord of the Rings book. They briefly explained to me how to take care of them, when to feed them, etc. It wasn't really hard to do. If anybody ever owns livestock, then they would probably know what I'm talking about. I asked them if there was any problems that ever arose. Predators, an animal going into labor that I wouldn't know what to do. They laughed and eased my thoughts, and told me I was overthinking it, that they hadn't had any problems like that, and I should be fine. I was probably just nervous. Little did I know that my life during the stay would change forever, and would of course involve sectors of the government I couldn't dare dream of. But again, I'll get on to that. Thankfully, the upkeep was very minimal, and after that, we went inside and hung out till the evening time, when it was time for them to go and head to the airport to catch their flight. We had a good homemade dinner, and a good talk, and they said their goodbyes. The 4 dogs were pretty in and out of the house. I knew they would keep me good company. I had Jack and Danielle's number, so if I needed anything, I would just be able to reach out to them first. We finally said our goodbyes, and then that was it. They headed off, and I would not see them again till the following Saturday after the next. It was Friday, and they were set to arrive back the Saturday morning after the next. 2 weeks exactly from the following morning. So more like 2 weeks and a half a day. Surprisingly, Jack and Danielle had pretty good internet out where they were, considering it was kind of just the middle of nowhere. There wasn't much around. Oh, and if you consider the desert beautiful, then you would be in heaven here. The next few days would prove fairly uneventful, and nothing really happened. I would go outside periodically and spend some time with the goats and play with the dogs. Other times I would watch TV, or play on my phone or what have you, even dinking around on YouTube. They had a really nice guest room with a very expensive mattress, so to say I slept like a baby is a complete understatement. It was either on the 3rd or 4th day, I can't remember. I woke up in the middle of the night to some loud banging and noise outside of the stable, and the goats screaming. I figured one of the dogs slipped out and was causing a ruckus, so I was already starting to get irritated because I was awakened from my perfect slumber. Groggy and angry, and getting up out of bed, I was getting ready to get out there and yell at the dogs for getting out of the stable, and I made it to the back door and opened it. Stepping out and walking to the stable, I continued to hear a bunch of commotion. I had a flashlight with me, so I'm shining it, and I get to the small stable door, and before I can open it, I hear something big trail off in the night behind the stables. I open the door, revealing all goats that were visibly fine, but they seemed incredibly shaken. I remember thinking, what was that? What on earth is going on? I was spooked, but my mind made excuses like it was probably a big coyote or something. The whole thing just gave me the heebie-jeebies. It felt wrong. After a few minutes of trying to calm them down, and myself, I decided it was time to go back to bed. Upon stepping back in the house, I see the 4 dogs passed out on the floor by the kitchen snoring. Yikes. I don't know how I missed that. I'm not really sure what happened there. Hopefully I don't have to deal with setting up traps to catch a coyote or something. And besides, I could have sworn I set the dogs in the stable. Maybe it will resolve itself, I thought. I went and laid back down, taking me probably an hour or 2 to finally fall back asleep. I was awakened by Missy slobbering all over my face that morning. The same next day, I went out to go check on the goats, which they seemed to be fine now, after their little strange extravaganza from last night. Now that it wasn't pitch black, I decided to walk on the back side of the stable, where I'd heard whatever it was jumped out and take off into the desert night. I could see that a piece of the stable had a broken opening. This left about a 3-foot hole in the bottom, and that a small animal could easily fit in. I couldn't tell if it had been like that way for a while, or something from the outside had broken in. My first instinct was to let Jack and Daniel know that we might have a coyote problem. I tried calling both their phones, but they were either off or no service. I got a call back from them later in the day, asking if everything was okay, and I briefly told them about what had happened and my findings. Jack instructed me to not hesitate to pull out his rifle that he had stored away, if I needed to, and they had issues with coyotes in the last few years, but not anytime recent. I kinda just said okay, sounds good. But once I got off the phone, I was freaking out. I'm just a kid from South California. I never even held a gun before, let alone shoot one off. I didn't even know how to load it. I can only hope that more problems didn't arise. A couple more nights came and went, and things seemed calm again. On one of the following nights, I was jolted awake by a slamming on the window, and when I turned, I nearly fell out of the bed. Glaring at me from the window was this hideous face you'd see out of a video game. If I were to give you a description, it looked just like the Faulkner from Skyrim, except it had large black eyes and long jagged teeth. I started screaming and ran out of the room. I don't know why it was slamming on the window. I guess it was trying to get in. My running into the living room freaked out the dogs and woke them up, and they started barking and going into a frenzy. I quickly grabbed a long knife from the kitchen and crouched down behind the counters and waited for the thing to get into the house. All the while, the dogs were going crazy. After sitting there for a couple of moments, I realized I had the advantage because I had 4 hungry dogs with me, or so I thought. I must have forgot to feed them dinner. I figured they would take quick work of whatever this was. So I quickly ran over to the sliding door, opened it, and let all 4 dogs out while they went haywire. I waited there by the sliding door for a few moments until they came back, but they didn't seem bothered anymore. I mean, really bothered at all. If anything, I think a few of them had used that opportunity to use the bathroom, but they didn't act like anything had been out of place. I was still freaked the hell out, so I locked up everything and went to lay down on the kitchen floor beside the cabinets with a knife in hand. I don't know what time I fell asleep. At this point, sleeping in the guest bedroom was now completely out of the question. The next morning, I had a terrible feeling in my gut. How on earth am I going to call Jack and tell him what happened? He's not going to believe me. Believe that some psycho in some Halloween mask tried to break into the house, if that is what even happened. Maybe I dreamt it. I don't know. Maybe I was going crazy. I decided that I was probably going stir crazy and was mentally losing it, so I decided to spend most of the day outside in hopes that the sun would help alleviate that. I spent some time looking around but didn't see anything that looked out of place. I honestly believed I was beginning to lose it. That night, I decided that it would be safe if I slept in the living room with the dogs around me and a knife on the table next to me, just in case anything happened. Like clockwork, I woke up again to the sound of goats going crazy in the stable, and like a soldier being woken up by combat, without thinking, I sat up to grab my knife and ran towards the sliding glass door with my flashlight. The dogs that too were awakened were going crazy, so I figured if we're all going out there, we'd be able to put a stop to whatever was causing havoc in the stable. This is where things turn from normal to absolute insanity, and I have to remind myself that yes, I was in reality when this happened. Me and the dogs run to the stable door, and there is so much noise going on. Before I go on to where I open the door, I could hear the goats screaming and going crazy, more intensely than they were before, of the previous night. The dogs around me are barking and going nuts, but I also heard some unknown noises along with all the other noise, hissing, and some sort of unknown animal screeching noise. I fling open the small stable door and shine my flashlight, and this is where my reality turned into that of a Hollywood horror movie. 5 goats remained in the spots they've always been, freaked out, and one of them was on the ground, dead. Its throat had been torn out and was being eaten on. However, it wasn't as simple as that, as much as I would like it to. When I shined my light, 2 unknown creatures looked to be in a brawl. One creature I saw had blood all over its face, and I immediately recognized it to be the same creature that had slammed on the guest bedroom window the other night. It was shorter than I expected, and kind of weird looking, almost alien-like, but terrifyingly humanoid with a large head and long spindly claws and fingers. What terrified me even more was the other creature that it was fighting against. It looked like a human and a dinosaur had a baby. It was very reptile-like, almost kind of like a dinosaur, I guess I would say. It had long black claws and jagged-like reptile teeth, and it was fighting the other animal. It also had piercing yellow eyes that seemed to glow. Both of these creatures dwarfed the goats around them, and the dogs that surrounded me straight up abandoned me and fled whining back to the house, just at the sight alone. I honestly feel like in that moment, I went into total shock and stood there paralyzed. This reptile creature pinned down the other creature, whatever it was, and tore a large piece of meat off of its side, where that creature screamed the most inhuman scream I've ever heard. They somehow didn't even notice me, or seem to care I was shining the light right on them, if this was going on. As it tore the chunk of meat off, blood splattered, and it pushed itself up and tore through the back of the stable, breaking much more of the wood off and ripping open the board, while this reptilian creature chased after it. Both creatures running on all fours with blood everywhere. Not only was the goat in front of me dead, with its throat torn out, but I also noticed that there was this weird slimy substance all over the inside of the stable. It's kind of like saliva-y, but it was different. It had a dark color to it and was very thick, kind of like a goop. Then there was the blood from whatever these two creatures were fighting against. I don't think I really had time to process what reality was, honestly. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and all I could do was phone the police and told them creatures were trying to break in and kill my goats. Even the operator was acting kind of strange about what I'd like to do. She kept saying, "What do you mean creatures?" I just kept saying, "I need an officer here now. I need an officer here now." About 12 minutes later, as I'm pacing around the front, trying to process whatever my reality now was, as an officer shows up outside the house. He was a very nice older gentleman who had heard what I had to say and then went back there to go check it out for himself. He comes back a few minutes later, and he asked that I call the owners, Jack and Danielle, and let them know that they were needed back here as soon as they could. The officer seriously explained to me, after observing everything that happened, that this was far more serious than he initially thought. Whatever that means. He left and kept things very vague. He really didn't give me any information. I immediately called Jack and Danielle, waking them up in the middle of the night, freaking out, telling them exactly what I saw that happened. They both went quiet. I was on speakerphone, so I heard both their reactions. They didn't say much, which kind of freaked me out even more. Jack just said he'll be there first thing in the morning, and he'll get a flight as soon as he could. I head inside the rest of the night with a knife in my hand, and the dogs, and not knowing what the hell I just saw, or if I was in some joke or prank show, or possibly a horror movie. Maybe somewhere along the way, somebody slipped me some LSD, and this was all just a bad trip. I honestly believe I was just in total shock, and that I couldn't fully process what was going on. For the next period of time, I want to say an hour, I sat there on the kitchen floor with 2 knives in my hand, waiting, rocking back and forth. I don't think I fell asleep, but felt extremely detached from reality. I heard a knock at the door. At this point, it's early on in the morning, still dark out. I put the knives down and answered it. It was several investigators who were asking me a bazillion questions. Their entire demeanor was hostile. They even looked funny. They reminded me of Secret Service agents. There was probably about 12 of them with large black SUVs, and they were all standing out in front, with several of them with strange equipment I have never seen before, heading towards where the stable had been, or where the stable was. They told me to step out of the house, and they detained me immediately and put me inside their SUV for the time being. I don't know how long I spent in the back of an SUV, but after some time, 4 of them climbed in the back and then blindfolded me. We drove for what felt like hours and hours, until we came to a stop. I was led by force out of the vehicle into this strange building, down several flights of stairs, until they sat me down into this large room. They took my blindfold off and my cuffs. I looked like I was in what appeared to be a large room that you would see in police stations used for questioning, except this was double the size and a little bit more dangerous looking. There were two of the same agents standing there at the door, guarding, when another agent came through. At this point, I was bawling, terrified, sleep deprived. I had no idea what was going on. Nobody was telling me anything. I didn't know where I was. I didn't even know if I was safe or who these people were. The man who sat directly at the table across from me appeared to be what I would call very polished. He looked artificial, if that makes sense. Like his skin didn't look right. I don't know if that means anything. He remained very mono-expressive and monotone. He showed zero emotion in his face or voice. He began by asking me some bizarre questions. Some I can't fully remember, but others I do remember. Like, what did you do when you saw the unknown animal observing you through the window a few nights ago? Things like that. I would freak and ask them how they knew these things, but he remained stern and didn't answer any of my questions. He only repeated his questions until I gave him an answer. After some back and forth, he got up quietly without saying a word and left the room. I sat there for probably God knows how long, and then he came back in the room again and sat down. He briefly told me that I'm never allowed to talk to anybody about my time at that location, what I saw or did, and I am never to speak to Jack and Danielle again. He reiterated that there would be serious repercussions if I denied those commands. I told him where to go and how to get there, and for the first time in our conversation, he gave a brief smirk and calmly said, "So be it," and got up and left. Two men entered the room, looking like every other strange service agent person, and held me down and injected some strange fluid into my neck. No matter how hard I fought, they seemed to have an iron grip over me, like it was unnatural. I couldn't fight back. I lost consciousness quickly. The next thing I know, I wake up in a hospital bed 4 days later in Southern California, only miles out from where I live with my parents at my bedside. I began screaming, crying, freaking out, screaming so loud that the doctors and nurses come rushing in to find out what's wrong. I began screaming that I needed to talk to Jack and Danielle. My parents just gave me the grimmest look, while the doctors and nurses were trying to calm me down. My dad sat down on the bed, looked off into space, and sighed. He said, "Son, nobody has been able to get a hold of either of them. It's been 4 days now. Nobody knows what happened. They've been reported missing, and there's already a missing persons report for each." I screamed more and more and questioned how I got here. What happened? I was told that I was found lying on the side of a highway nearly 12 miles from this hospital and was taken here when someone found me. I couldn't stop crying. I was literally going insane. I remembered everything. As soon as things became calmer, the doctors and nurses left the room and gave my parents and I our privacy. I told them everything that had happened while I was there, and that I was taken by these strange men. They just looked at me and told me they're going to let me rest. I don't think they believed me. Surprisingly, they didn't even ask how I ended up 12 miles out on the middle of a highway being picked up by somebody. I don't know why or how. Fast forward in time until right now, where I moved out shortly after coming home from the hospital. I moved out with some friends and moved states away where I could work a small job. I haven't been mentally right since this traumatic event occurred. It's really screwed me up emotionally. I still have never talked to Jack or Danielle since this occurred, and don't know what became of them. I tried sending them handwritten letters to their address, only to get my mail sent back to me, saying that address doesn't exist. I've tried calling them, but the numbers just nothing exist. I've had an increasingly difficult time with life as of late, and have even contemplated suicide. Something happened that I wasn't supposed to see or be a part of. Something that involved the government. I feel like I'm in some weird episode of X-Files or something. More importantly, I want to know what happened to Jack and Danielle. The last time I spoke to them was over the phone that night, and that was it. I wonder what happened to them, if they ever made it back. I'm sorry this is so long, but I'm so desperate to reach out for help. I've already reached out to multiple people, groups, individuals, all telling my story, and nobody is taking me seriously, even as big as a risk as I am taking. I don't know what else much to do. I want to know what happened, what I saw, and what that had to do with me being detained and questioned. Who are the people that detained me? Why was I being questioned? Where is Jack and Danielle? I need some answers. For now, I'm going to try and remain sane, even in this quarantine where life is even more uncertain. So, I got the chance to reconnect with some of my friends over in Colorado, who are also of the Sioux tribe and Arapaho. These are the people that shared with me the same tales recently that I've discussed with you. The dogman and Bigfoot waging wars against each other to be able to eat the Arapaho tribe that was defending themselves against these beasts. They love and watch your channel, and they wanted me to share more of their stories that they have. These are stories that they have obtained from their own chiefs that have been passed down from generations, as well as more tales from their own tribe that they would like to share with you. My other friend, who is part Sioux, also has very similar tales from his own tribe, dealing with not only Bigfoot and dogmen, but what they consider to be the thunderbird as well, especially more so in the Great Plains area. There were just certain places that were off limits for hunting and foraging, for any sort of food and supplies, because these large birds patrolled the perimeter of the area. Usually, it was always in the upper mountainside, but other times it wasn't. Supposedly, somewhere along the way, one of the chief's daughters had befriended a thunderbird and was able to ride it before it tricked her and knocked her off its back while up in midair, and she fell to her death. Thunderbirds, from what I've gathered, aren't near as hostile as dogmen are, or Bigfoot, but they would take pride in stealing kills from hunters by swooping down and taking the deer whole or waiting for the kill to claim the body. Unlike other birds, they have a very distinctive call, kind of like how a hawk does, or even an eagle. You could hear it from far away and know exactly what kind of bird it was. I wasn't told any story about a thunderbird having a conflict with a Bigfoot or a dogman, but I'm sure it has happened. They were more elusive than the other two creatures and were not near as hostile or aggressive. They were not attacking villages, but they were waiting and watching a lot of the time. Many of the times, they would show up in full view of the villages and they would bring upon them storms, droughts, famine, and worse. They almost acted like an omen, even though they weren't seen as much. There is a reason they have a name Thunderbird. Although the Arapaho and Sioux Indians had their own name for them, just like they did with Dogman and Bigfoot, I don't think their name had any direct translation to Thunderbird, but it did mean something similar. The one friend of mine who was Sioux Indian shared with me some stories about back in the early 1800s, that these giant blackbirds with white markings on them would fly out of the mountains in South Dakota, fly down, pick up villagers and hunters, even white men, and fly up high in the air and drop them to kill them. From the sounds of it, these things didn't fly into the villages, but anybody who wandered into a specific area or territory was generally targeted. This leads me to believe that between both my friends who shared very similar stories, that the Thunderbird is not only a very real cryptid, but, like the other two cryptids, Dogman and Bigfoot, are very territorial beings. While seeming much more elusive, they still can be just as dangerous, since they can just easily pick a person up with ease and drop them from 100+ feet in the air to their death. A couple of hunters had found a large bird nest, as they described, near the base of one of the mountains that they were near, and found many human skulls and bones. It wasn't made entirely clear if these cryptids would pick people up and drop them from the sky to kill them and then eat them, or if it was just a killing tactic to eliminate threats. The feathers from these creatures were humongous. These creatures persisted even when white men started traveling to the area and colonizing. They too became victim and knew the ferocity of these cryptids. Unfortunately, muzzle loaders and guns didn't seem to be effective against these kinds of flying beasts, but there were certain areas that they would not venture into in fear that these things would grab them. I'm almost wondering if states with very rocky terrain, with lots of mountains and hills, makes the perfect environment for these kinds of cryptids. Plenty of places to hide, and more than enough places to have a nest without anyone ever bothering you or discovering where you are. Even today, there is still miles upon miles of wilderness all over the US that remains uncharted or too thick for us humans to venture off into. It's very possible that these things have made their nests in places that are impossible for us to get to, especially with the vast amount of mountains and steep cliffs that are all over. In fact, I recently listened to one of your other Thunderbird stories, where a gentleman climbed down a steep cliff, if I'm remembering correctly, and discovered what he thought was a thunderbird's nest. Well, his description was pretty close to what my friend's story matched up with. And his story, I believe, they were animal bones, but in that story I got from my friend, they only found human remains. I don't really tend to find too much evidence, though, based on what I know about these things, that there's any signs of them ever being on the East Coast. However, the signs that I was hearing about that happen on the East Coast resemble that of a pterodactyl. Those sightings go all the way down to the southern Florida area, even into Cuba. No, it's not a thunderbird, but there seems to be a continuity with these large flying bird-like cryptids all around the United States. Going back to that thunderbird encounter though you posted, before the man who went down to the cliff in Northern California, I had heard other thunderbird encounters around that area before. It seems like when you mix mountain cliffs and forests, you create the environment for these things to thrive in. I personally believe that's why there are so many good sightings in the state of Colorado, such as reptilians, Bigfoot, dogman, thunderbird, and more. I find it very interesting that several of the supposed encounters and sightings that many of the natives recall of this thunderbird are usually all large blackbirds of some sort. They all talk about the same thing, distinctive white markings on their body, which never seem to coincide with a specific pattern or shape. I've heard some descriptions that talk about it being very similar looking to a stark black eagle, while others say that it looks more like a raven. I've heard others say that it looks like its own bird entirely, with a pointed down beak at the end, kind of like a falcon has. Either way, we need to keep close eyes on the skies around us when we're out, and if we see something large flying our way, we know it's near. A family friend of mine operates a small seaplane business in Florida where people pay a small sum of money and he takes them out on a tour throughout overlooking the Everglades. Well, it was my birthday, and I had never been on a plane before. Shocking, I know. Just so you can get an idea of how small these planes are, they're practically 2-passenger planes, I think. You know, the ones that fly over water. They're pretty small compared to any commercial airline, but large enough for you to get around in. They aren't luxurious by any means, and I'm not a planes girl by any means, so I just know they're called seaplanes. If I had to guess, I'm gonna say 20 to 30 feet from the front nose to the very back. I really have no idea how big the wingspan is. As I was saying, this family friend of mine took me out for my birthday, and we're flying over the Everglades, and when he starts panicking and pointing out in front of us, flying a little underneath us and perpendicular, was the largest bird we have ever seen in our lives. I vaguely heard of a creature called the thunderbird, but I've not known what it is. Now, I don't know if this is a thunderbird or if it's real, but I do know now that there are very large birds out there that far exceed any size we know about. The bird I saw was extremely large and a very predatory looking bird at that. All gray that faded to a smoky charcoal color. This bird had a wingspan that easily matched the size of the plane we were in. I couldn't believe it. My friend and I were in total awe and could not stop staring at this monstrosity of a bird. It was flying relatively low, only a little higher than the tips of the trees, and it never once seemed to look up in our direction or even care that we were flying over. It didn't come across like it was in a hurry, just calmly flying in the direction it was heading, which was south. It's all him and I could talk about for the rest of the flight. We had no idea what kind of bird it was, and we're convinced that we discovered a new species of swamp bird. Little do I know now that I probably more than likely saw an actual thunderbird in the flesh. This took place when I was 14 years old, camping in a little area of land in western Maryland where lots of my mom's family had little cabins. This was in the middle of nowhere, on private property, and everyone on the mountain was related to us one way or another. We grew up spending the summers around the campfire, telling scary stories and running around with all of my cousins. Quick explanation of layout. Imagine a large capital T for a road. Above the T, by 150 feet, ran Savage River. If you went left on the T, it would take you past multiple family house, but also dense forest that cut off the road. If you went all the way to the right of the T, was my mom's tiny cabin, where we stayed. I often went off on my own, preferring it that way. I was about to do just that when my aunt had asked me to tag along. She's 14 years older than I am, and a big kid. She had pink in her hair at the time, covered in tattoos, and is almost 6 feet tall. So, not easily intimidated. So I had decided that we'd go all the way to the left, into the dense forest, and she's fine with that, admitting that she had come with me so she could smoke a joint and keep out of eyesight of my disapproving grandmother. Now, I was a good kid. Even though she offered me a hit, the thought of drugs still scared me, so I declined. From the end of the road was a super rough dirt path into the woods, with the river still running 150 feet above the path. If you were to walk towards the river, it goes on a downward slope. A few miles in, you'll actually come across one of those legendary random staircases that led to nowhere. On this particular day, I had taken the dirt path and had walked down the 150 feet along the river, watching the fish and crawdads scurry as my aunt got high as a kite, a little bit behind me. I was in my own little world when I suddenly heard a click noise that brought me back to reality. I look up and around, confused. Then my eyes land on some man that I've never seen before, standing across the river from me, no more than 15 feet from me. He must have just walked out of the woods on the other side of the river. It's summer, but he's in a black jacket and raggedy jeans and is holding one of those old cheap non-digital yellow cameras that you would roll the top and click it to be able to take another picture. I was stunned because I had never seen anyone other than my family anywhere around the area in all the years that I'd been going up there. He smiled at me slightly, lowering his camera. He was older, probably 40s, and very scruffy, tall and kinda thin. He takes a step forward, and I turn to take a step back. He scrolls the top of the camera and points it directly at me again. I am literally at the loss of words and can only manage to take another step back, almost slipping on a rock as I do. That's when my aunt stumbles to the trees and is in mid-sentence about how much she missed being high when she stopped and stared at the man. I was just staring at her, at this point, frozen like a deer in the headlights. I slowly turn, and he's not looking at my aunt. He's staring right at me. He clicks the camera again at us, and then he does something that makes my blood run cold and turns the situation from weird to terrifying. He does the tut-tut-tut thing with his finger and points to what looks like a knife sheathed and strapped to his hip, and then points a finger that he slices across his throat. That's the moment that I went into autopilot. I spun around and began barreling through the trees, grabbing onto my aunt. My heart pounded as I ran, though I could have sworn I heard one more click before I could hear the splashing from behind me. I almost collapsed because my legs felt like jelly. The river is really deep in parts, but where I had been, we're at a point where the water would have been only thigh deep to a grown man. I tore upwards and ran blindly, like a rabbit from a fox. When we saw the stairs, my aunt quickly yanked me to the other side and slid down beside me as we caught our breath. I was wheezing so loud, I had to cover my mouth to try and muffle the sound. I peer around, but the trees are so dense, I can't see the river from the stairs. But even with my hammering heartbeat, I hear the snapping of branches, like someone barreling through the forest. Now, I am very, very scared. It's not an easy straight trail back into my family property. You have to weave around, and in spots, it dips and gets rocky, so you have to do like an S shape to get through. There's random rocks everywhere, and it would be so easy to twist an ankle or to smack into a tree in my panic. Not to mention, we would always tread careful and look where we were going because there are so many snakes in that area. I'm sobbing and wheezing badly, and we had another few miles until we'd even hit the first part of my family's property. My mind is racing, but I know we can't stay. Neither of us had any type of weapon, and staying here was making it harder for me to convince myself to run as paralyzing terror crept in. My legs and arms already cut up, and before I can decide what to do, my aunt pulls me towards the T road, desperately, just stumbling and running. I don't make it more than another mile until I misstep and trip over a branch, tripping and smacking headfirst into a tree. I crumple over, taste blood. I had bit through my lip in the fall. I am dazed, but my adrenaline is still pumping, so I scramble to a T as my aunt turns and notices that I'm not right behind her. She scrambles back and drops to her knees in front of me, whispering. I'm dazed, but she keeps repeating that we need to keep going. I'm shaking so bad, I don't think I could walk, much less run. I have probably another mile and a half until I'm on my family's property, but another 2 until we're at an occupied cabin, my grandmother's. My ears are ringing, and I'm hardly paying attention to my aunt's frantic pleas. I completely psych myself out again and keep looking behind me, but I don't see anything. She decides that she's not going to waste any more time because of stupid me, and half drags me up and forward. I hobble forward as quick as I can as she continues to pull me too quickly. The rest is a blur until we break through the trees. Most of my family wasn't there at the time, so we only stop when we make it to my grandmother's, and I just run in, sobbing. No one locks the doors around there, and my grandmother takes one horrified look at me and my aunt, who is equally cut up and scared looking, and yells for my grandfather, who promptly takes over and grabs his rifle. I can't put into sentences what just happened, so my aunt takes over, leaving out the part about her being as high as a kite. He and my grandmother go to cabin, gathering the men and their guns, as well as warning the women and children about what just occurred. There's no signal up there, so calling the sheriff wasn't an option, and to get up to the mountain, if they left immediately, would take over an hour. It's getting dark. The roads leading up to the property are so windy and steep, you'd have to be out of your mind to try and drive up them in the dark. My mother eventually got word and came over. She took one look at my aunt and said that I had probably just gotten high with her, which in turn made us overly paranoid, and when we saw the random fisherman who was trespassing, we jumped to conclusions and had probably startled him as much as he had startled us. She continued by saying that I probably just imagined he was taking my picture, or that he began chasing us, though my aunt had been the one to repeatedly retell the story. My aunt stood up and yelled at my mother, saying that I was a good kid and didn't do anything, and that we were telling the truth. They began screaming at each other, and my grandmother made them both stop, telling them both to grow up. Even with the men of my family scouring the woods, they never saw any sign of the man we had encountered earlier. Everyone on the mountain locked their doors that night, though, for the first time in a long time. And to this day, all I can wonder is if I'm part of some creepy picture collection. But considering what could have happened, maybe if I had been alone like normal, I can live with that. Because my parents had separated before I was born, I spent my time growing up between each of their houses. Each summer, until I turned 19, I stayed with my father in rural Missouri. He had grown up in the area himself, and most of his family still lived there. Without much to do, like going to the movies and stuff, I would fill my days hanging out with my older cousin and getting into mischief. Many of our long summer days were taken in wandering the surrounding woods. On one of these journeys, we came across a big lake sitting quietly by itself, out in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods. The water was crystal clear and filled with tons of monstrous fish. We asked the adults if they were aware of its existence, but none have heard of it. That was probably the reason for it having so many large fish. No one living in the area had fished it, and anyone who had in the past allowed its location to be lost. We would fish the pond 3 or 4 times, coming away with a stringer full of lunkers on each occasion. On the 5th occasion, we hoped to accumulate enough for a big family fish fry. The summer holiday was starting to wind down, and we figured a fish fry would be a great way to cap it off. It was a warm Saturday morning when we headed out. We started about an hour before sunup, because the walk in took well over an hour. Besides, the fish stopped biting by the hottest part of the day, and we hoped to get back to my dad's house by early afternoon. The beautiful sight of the pond came into view around dawn. It didn't take long for us to get our first bites, and for the next 3 hours, the fish came quickly, one after another. Our limit was caught by 10:45, and I was rearing to get going. We had a 90-minute walk back with 2 5-gallon buckets packed to the top with fish. So, I imagined another 30 could be added to that. To my displeasure, my cousin thought it would be refreshing to take a dip in the lake before we left. He tried to pressure me into joining him, but I didn't know how to swim at the time. I just wanted to get back, but he was older than me, so he was in charge. I plopped my tail onto a rock and waited while he did his thing. There was an old rope tied to a tree, probably from 100 years ago, and he wanted to swing from it. It looked unsafe to me. However, my concerns were laughed off as he stripped down to his boxers, setting his clothes on the ground next to me. He climbed the tree a little ways and grabbed the rope. Pushing off, he swung out just a short distance before the rope snapped right above him. He'd made it out far enough to hit the deep water, but probably not as far as he intended. When he hit the water, his body made a dull thud sound. It certainly didn't sound normal, and likely hurt. I was planning on laughing at him, saying I told you so, but as the seconds passed, he never surfaced. The situation was quickly becoming scary. I looked around to see if he came up somewhere further away, perhaps floating unconscious because of the hard contact with the water, but still nothing. I was beginning to panic, and waded out as far as I dare, looking into the water for him. Unfortunately, the water became cloudy with every step I took, and made it impossible to see. Soon, it was clear to me that he had drowned. How? I had no idea. Perhaps if I could have swam back then, I may have been able to help him, but it was too late now. I was helpless to do anything more than pack up and head home. On the entire walk back, a small nugget of hope lingered in the back of my mind that he had tricked me and would pop up at some point. This didn't happen, however, and the dread I carried of telling my family grew with each step. I tried several times to find the words, but with each attempt, I would break down and choke on my tears. Ultimately, I could only manage, "Mark drowned." They got the point after that, and once I was able to pull myself together, I led my dad and uncle back out to the pond. Mark's body was still nowhere to be found. With no other options, we went into the sheriff's office to report the drowning. When I realized where we were headed, I started freaking out. In my young mind, I thought I was going to get in trouble or be blamed for my cousin's death. It took a few minutes, but they were able to convince me that I wasn't in trouble. Even after they had, I couldn't help but feel guilty every time I looked at my uncle, regardless of what he claimed. I couldn't believe he didn't blame me, even if it was just a small amount. I explained what happened to the sheriff, and the search began the next morning. Just by chance, that was the day I was going back to my mother's. That Monday night, my mom sat me down to tell me that a team of divers had found Mark's body earlier that day. When they discovered him, one of his feet were hung up on a sunken log, so they assumed that was why he never surfaced. I wish I could say this made me feel better, but it did not. It did, however, serve as a catalyst to learn how to swim. The guilt of not being able to help my cousin stayed with me for most of my life, and I never wanted to be in the position of not being able to help another person ever again. So in a twisted kind of way, his death had a positive impact on my life. However, if I had the choice, I'd prefer he still be with us. I know there is in fact animals that we don't know about that live among us without us ever knowing their existence. Back in the 90s, when I was going down a long, steep cliff in a ravine in a smaller canyon, I came across a nest of something large. I'll spare you the boring details about my background, but I was traveling down the steep ravine in Northern California on a personal expedition I was doing. I did this kind of stuff all the time, so I knew how to go about it. I came across a small drop-off where I could catch my footing and could also catch my breath. If you walked about 10 feet to your right, it led to this tiny outcropping underneath the rock. From the top of the canyon, or where the cliff that I came from was, you would never be able to even see it because it's almost like looking directly down. It was directly under this outcropping that I saw this giant, well, what I would describe as nest. It looked like a bunch of old branches and other miscellaneous brush that was neatly placed in a large area, big enough for a grizzly bear to sleep in. My mind immediately went to bears, but I know bears don't make nests like this. They also usually make dens in caves, and this was in May. Bears would be out and about in the spring, so that could have been it. Also, there's no way a bear would be able to climb down this steep of a cliff and have no reason for a bear to make a den in this small outcropping. The only thing that makes sense in my mind, which I know sounds insane, is a pterodactyl. It definitely had to be something that can fly, but the nest just didn't make sense. It was so incredibly large that no known bird should live in it. I've been out in the wild enough, and I've seen hawks, falcons, eagles, and other large birds of prey, like even vultures, and I've seen the nests these things make. This nest, however, trumped all of them in size. It was very discernible as some sort of bird nest. Being very intrigued, I took my time and sought after any clues I could find. Any old eggshell fragments or possibly bones. Buried underneath the brush, I found a couple of old stag bones and a couple of doe skulls. There were a few femur bones here and there, and a few possible rib bones that came from either a cow or a deer, judging by the shape and size. I don't know about you, but I have no idea what birds eat on the remains of a cow or deer. I knew I was dealing with some sort of bird of prey, and after I found those bones, which looked to be very old by the way, maybe it wasn't a good idea that I stuck around as long as I did. I felt like I had a false sense of comfort, because the nest to me felt like it had been abandoned. There is some overgrowth coming from the sides, and brush and branches that the nest was made out of looked unkempt and messed up, and hadn't been laid in or laid on in some time. Then it dawned on me that I believe I discovered a nest of some unknown, large bird of prey. I don't know what kind, and I would certainly not want to meet it, but that's just what I believe. Again, I firmly believe that this is the nest that was no longer in use, but I didn't feel like it was appropriate to stick around longer, just in case I was wrong. With the environment around it, where the nest is and was, it created the perfect getaway hiding spot for whatever large bird made this nest here. No predators or any egg thieves would be able to reach it, and stayed far out of the eyesight or earsight of anyone happening to wander through the area. Had I not glanced over when I caught my footing, I would have gone right past it down the ravine wall. During my time of expeditions and climbing up and down cliffs, I have found a lot of cool stuff, and this one is hands down the best one. Since you seem to be the expert on cryptids and possible unknown animals, you might have some insight as to what exactly I stumbled upon. I'm going to start this off and let you know that I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. There's no way anybody could hallucinate such a thing. I've already gotten ample disbelief from friends and family who chose not to believe my story, and I guess I can't blame them, having never seen what I did. That's okay though. I just accept that there's more out there than we know, and it's funny. I used to think that we've explored everything there is to explore on this planet, but I guess I was wrong. There are certain creatures that are really good at hiding, because otherwise we would all know about them by now, right? Almost 6 years ago, I was spending some time out in the bayous of Louisiana and western Florida, scouting out some great places to fish. I do all of my adventures soloing. I'm just a very independent person, and I like the solace of being alone. I guess in this case, it worked out against me, because had I had a witness with me, I feel like I would have been that much more credible. Oh well. I reached an open spot that was right near the ocean. The Gulf, actually. It was still very swampy, but you can kind of see the ocean from where I was. It was a spot where the swamp actually kind of opened up inland. I had hiked off the road for quite a few miles in this dense swamp. I didn't have any of my equipment with me, because I was just getting out of location, like I said, just seeing what was around the area. For those that aren't aware of the environment here, it's humid as hell, with alligators and insects everywhere. It can be extremely treacherous if you don't know your environment, and you become too prideful and arrogant. I was under the impression already that I was not in my safe zone, and I needed to tread very lightly. There's also poisonous snakes and other things out here that can kill you or hurt you. I guess you can say that is part of the thrill. Once I reached the open area that the swamp came in inland, I noticed there were quite a few alligators in the water, and a few hanging out on the embankment across from the swamp that I was at. I had to be extremely careful at traversing and treading where I was going. I didn't plan on going into the water at all, even if it only was knee deep. I wasn't risking anything. I go past my side of the embankment and start to head towards the innermost part of the swamp that goes back into the direction north. As I'm heading in that direction towards the swamp, I hear a huge sound behind me, probably about 30 yards away. Whatever it was had to have been large, because I hear this large force coming down from the sky. It was the sound of wind being moved. It stopped me in my tracks, and I turned. This is what I saw, and I kid you not, I am not crazy. Plain as day, this massive bird, I don't know what you would call it, because I only saw it for about a second or two before it descended and ascended again. From the glimpse I got, it kind of looked like an eagle, but it was all black with white markings along its wings and back that I had never seen before. That's not what shook me. It was the sheer size and what it did that took my breath away. The wingspan on this monster had to have been easily 20 feet in length if it was standing on the ground, and I'm probably being conservative. This bird was probably 10 to 12 feet tall if standing. I mean it when I said this was a massive animal. It was so large that as it descended out into the sky, it made an audible noise. I turned and saw it descending right as I was about to go to the ground, and then I realized it was doing something. It had its sights set on this large alligator that was sitting right there on the embankment, on the opposite side that I was, near a large tree. It descended, and with its massive talons, grabbed this alligator in one swift motion, picked it up with its talons, and flew off, just like that. It was like watching a hawk grab a field mouse and then take off. It was nothing to this bird, or whatever it was. It didn't even look like the alligator that got grabbed had even any time to react. and just 1 second, it got scooped up and then gone. To give you some more detail about the environment, even though it was all bog and swamp, there was enough sky opening in this part of the swamp that the bird was easily able to navigate down from the sky into. It wasn't so thick and covered that it made it impossible or tough for this bird to fly out of. It was very open, with lots of sun coming through. The bird itself didn't make any noise like squawks or screams, kind of like what you'd expect, but it was moving so much faster, and so much so that it was audible. It's kind of like if you take a stick and start waving it really fast, you'll start hearing that whipping sound in the air. That's just from you moving around. It was kind of the same thing, if that makes any sense. It all happened so fast that I nearly soiled my pants as this happened. And that moment, I gave up any and all hope that I would find any remote fishing spot safely, and took off quickly back to my truck, parked a couple of miles in the direction I was heading. It really did terrify me, and it kind of stopped my adventuring out in places that I don't necessarily know too well. I don't know what it was. I don't know what kind of birds naturally live out in the swamp. Whatever this was, though, took down an alligator like it was nothing. And let me clarify this with you. The alligator that it grabbed wasn't a small 3-foot gator. This was a decent-sized 6 to 7 foot length adult alligator. I don't know if you'll believe my story, and I was even hesitant to write this up and send it to you, but I figured it's worth a shot. Sometimes I feel like it's a burden to keep this on me and not tell anybody about it. I've asked friends and family if they know of any large birds that live out in the swamps, or any birds that eat alligators, and I'm just responded to with strange looks. I still feel uncomfortable telling my story to people, in fear of rejection. I think I'll get over it eventually, and I know for me, typing this out to you and processing what happened is helping me work through it. It was just such a surreal experience. I don't think I'll ever fully process it all. Hey, I've been wanting to reach out to you for a little while now, but now that I have some free time, I can finally sit down and write out to you. I used to have a friend who passed away about 7 years ago from a really bad car accident. Hit a semi-truck. God rest his soul. This man used to do all sorts of water sports, diving, fishing. The man lived in the water. He was kind of a freak, but I mean that in the best and loving way. I grew up close with him, so he was like a brother to me. The man loved to fish and even was training to do Olympic-style swimming. If my memory serves me correctly, he had even done some stints back in the 90s and early 2000s to where he swam 50 plus miles or something like that. I could be wrong on that, but it was something crazy, I do know that. Well, he was also known to my family and circle of friends for his diving that he would do. He was a huge fan of looking for wrecks and things like that. Old wreckage just really excited him. He had gone diving off the coast of California, New York, Maine, Florida, Texas, you name it, and even spent quite a bit of time in the Gulf. Since I'm not a diver, I don't know what goes into it professionally, the skills you need or the equipment. But from being good friends with him and being very close, I know he was very good at it. When we would catch up on the phone and have talks, he would go on and tell me about some of the amazing diving adventures that he would have had and some amazing things that he would discover. Now, I've been a watcher of your channel for over a year now, and I see that just very recently you started covering a topic about deep sea related things, and I thought, what a perfect opportunity for me to share with you his stories. The first story I'm going to share with you was back in 2010 when he was wreck diving in Lake Superior, north of Wisconsin, but closer to the eastern border of North Dakota. He had gone diving with 2 other close individuals, one of who was seriously hospitalized during this incident. Luckily, him and his other friend remained unscathed. The story goes that they dove down there looking for wreckage of any kind, and they thought they had spotted some. But that's when one of the friends discovered what appeared to be a large transparent blob-like figure floating in the water. This blob-like figure was around 8 to 9 feet tall, and probably about 12 feet in width from what he told me. A giant massive bulb of a blob. It was opaque and off-white in color. It didn't really move like a jellyfish or jellyfish-like being, like you would probably think. He explained it was kind of floating in the water. Well, the one friend who swam close to it to observe it better, at a closer distance, started experiencing severe third-degree burns all over his body, minus the backside, just the front side to where he became exposed to this. He swam close, and he began screaming and had to ascend back up to the boat, where my friend and his friends followed after him. Going back up to the boat, all three of them, he took off his wetsuit and discovered his skin on the front of his torso, face and arms were literally boiling and nearly falling off. He had to be life-flighted to a hospital to where he experienced severe skin grafts. I wasn't told every single detail, but that's what he explained to me. He also got severe nitrogen poisoning because he ascended so quickly. That story alone freaked me out, and I asked him what he thinks it was. They were probably about 70 feet down, and as you know, there's not a whole lot of light. So, they were using the lights that they had with them, and as it got close, the friend of course started immediately experiencing this sort of pain sensation. After the person got out of the hospital, he said it was like a severe chemical burn, and not like a fire burn. It was the strong searing pain all over his flesh. He did not receive burns on his backside, only his skin that was closest to this blob. He got probably within 20 feet of it, and from what my friend who passed away told me, it's safe to say that their wreckage diving was cut short that day. They never did tell anybody what exactly happened or what they saw, out of fear that they'd be accused of attempted murder. Again, nobody has any idea what it was or what it could have been. I speculated with him that it could have been some sort of jellyfish or man-o-war, but he's gone diving in the ocean so many times, he knows what both of those creatures look like very well. This looked nothing like neither of them, and there were no visible tentacles anywhere near this blob figure. There was no indication from the water temperature that it emitted light or any sort of heat. My friend, the one who passed away, came to the ultimate conclusion, which is just a wild guess, but the best guess in my opinion, was that it was indeed giving off severe amounts of radiation. It's the only explanation that he can come up with that would actually answer it, but it doesn't fully make 100% sense. It's still just a mystery. Another time, he was also wreck diving off the coast of Maine with a larger crew of people. I don't recall how many miles he was off the coast, but I know it was somewhat significant. I think they actually had a particular wreck they were looking for, but I might be wrong on that. He mentioned to me that somewhere down near the bottom, as they were scouting, an amphibious type of hand, many times larger than his own, reached out from underneath the sand and silt and grabbed onto his wetsuit, nearly tearing it open with so much force. The creature swam out of the silt and away from him. He described it as very mermaid-looking, but not in a fantasy or traditional sense that we all think. He described it as a more humanoid, half-man, half-fish sense. Described the face as very humanoid-looking, with large black eyes and large scaly hands with webbing in between the fingers. It had a strange purple oozing bruise on his leg, and it gripped him so hard. When they had gotten out of the water, he had this weird plasma-like goop all over his leg where it grabbed him. It freaked out all the other divers because it was so sudden and out of nowhere. After it grabbed onto him, it pulled itself out of the silt and swam away in the opposite direction. He said it was a very large creature and estimated it to be between 13 and 16 feet in length, and described the upper body being very humanoid looking, but also very amphibious. The bottom half was just like an elongated fish body with a long tail. This is why and where he used the term mermaid. Yet another dive ended prematurely. Even with these strange events, these things have not stopped him from going out practically living in the water. This man has also been face to face with barracuda, sharks, and a bunch of other extremely dangerous situations underneath the water. There's even one time where he accelerated too quickly, just like his other friend, and nearly died of nitrogen poisoning back when he was just a rookie diver. Yet, he's taken out by a semi-truck in the winter. It was a tragedy. We all figured he would have gone out either drowning or being eaten alive, but that's not what his final chapter looked like. The fact of the matter is, no matter what situation he found himself in, life-threatening or not, he still pursued the thrill of the deep water. I think wreck scavenging was probably his #1 pastime, among other things. Of course, he too also had stories, because he had some close friends who were in the Navy and other parts of the military that had some kind of classified information from what I was explained to. One of my favorite stories of his that he tells me is that his one longtime Navy friend, who he concealed the identity of because he didn't want any information to be revealed about this particular individual. This individual was sailing in the South Pacific back in the early 80s on a smaller military boat, when an extremely large object appeared on the radar machinery. At first glance, they all thought it should be an opposing submarine, but realized it was actually a bio-life form. Whatever it was estimated to be anywhere between 90 feet to 150 feet in length, and was also several miles down under the water. Or, there's another similar situation where back in the late 70s, they had an entire submarine and crew perish due to being attacked by some unknown large creature. Whatever it was had to have been large enough to take down a military tier submarine in the Pacific Ocean. Over 80 crew and 11 officers all perished with the submarine. The assailant of the submarine was never made known, but it was documented that there was indeed a struggle, and the submarine fired off all of its missiles against the unknown assailant, but made no luck. This was, from what I've been told, about 200 miles southwest off the coast of Alaska. I've also heard stories from several places where military personnel have talked about finding washed up, half-eaten whale carcasses with humongous bites taken out of them. These whale carcasses were partially devoured or halfway devoured. These have been usually found in the areas that military personnel were deployed close by. The one that comes to my mind is a story where an individual, a different one, a sergeant, whose name I will not mention, encountered 3 of these dead whales at once that had washed up right near an undisclosed military base. All 3 of them showed the same signs of being partially eaten, devoured by the same large predator. This predator had taken out chunks of meat so large and massive in its bite that the bite marks dwarfed that of a great white shark in comparison. It's stories like that that will keep me out of the ocean. These kinds of sightings were actually far more common than you can imagine. The military has all sorts of reports on large water amphibians and reptilians that are classified, apparently. For example, if you Google this, there is a case back in 1914, I believe, I might be unsure of the year, of a large military ship seeing a large water crocodile that was estimated to be around 60 feet in length. I can't remember where, and I want to say it was off the Europe coast, but you can find out. This information was kept from the public for quite some time, but all it takes is for you to know somebody who knows somebody. Unfortunately, once my friend passed, all of his connections who knew stuff and had stories were severed with his death. He had good friends in many places, but fortunately, he was able to tell me a lot of them before he died. He and I would just sit down and spend hours talking over the phone, or if we were in person, have a few beers and just talk, and he would tell me story after story. Not always creature stuff, but situations he was in, where he almost died, or incredible diving stories. I just thought you would find these 2 particular cases I shared with you interesting, since it fit right up your alley. Okay, so I was about 14 at the time, and I grew up pretty poor. My mother at this time really was slowly disappearing from my life, to where I was later on homeless. But at this time, she was still around me, and we were sleeping on the kitchen floor, as it was the comfiest floor in the house. I regularly get night terrors and sleep paralysis, but this time it felt different. I woke up immediately feeling like I was being watched. I found it hard to breathe. I was just so terrified. Everything in my mind told me not to open my eyes, but being as curious as I am, I opened them anyways. What I saw, I'll never forget. I saw this creature. It looked to be about 7 feet tall, but somehow fit into our small apartment hallway. Its bones were all deformed and broken, but it didn't look like it was in any pain. At this point, I had sat up and started to move backwards, away from this thing. It was all white and had hair everywhere. There was something draining from its mouth, and when it would move nearer to me, I could hear this thing's bone cracking. I closed my eyes, hoping it would go away, but I could still hear it. I started actually screaming, and my mother woke up and yelled at me for screaming. But I told her what had happened, and when I opened my eyes, it was gone. My mother continues to insist I'm lying, but I swear what I saw that night was real, and it was not human. This story takes place in the deserts of Arizona. Me and my dad are on a camping trip with the rest of our family, but thanks to the size of the family, we had to take 2 cars. 1 car for the boys and 1 for the girls. I had 3 sisters, but I was the only boy. 3 hours later, and nightfall approaches, making it harder to drive with only 1 headlight working. So my dad decides we should stop and camp there for the night. I said I was down, as long as we could sleep in the car. Not really camping, but if you had to choose between a car seat and the ground, then we'll talk. Anyway, he agreed, so we drove off the road and onto the sand with cactus as far as the eye can see. We both began our descent into slumber. Only I couldn't, as I was a bit of an insomniac, which I was fine with. It just meant I could look up at the night sky. But then I heard a blood-curdling screech of some kind of humanoid howling at the vast emptiness of the desert. At first, I thought it was a coyote, but coyotes don't sound like that. Frozen solid, I look out the window to see a tall, lanky creature standing on all 4s of its extremely long, unnatural appendices. At first glance, it would have just blended in with the cacti surrounding the area, with its seemingly prickly skin. But I didn't just peek and look away. I was flat out staring at it until my eyes locked with its 2 small white dots, was all I could see. I'm pooping bricks at this point, but bricks turn to boulders as it full out charges at the small car, which could easily be flipped with very little effort. I guess all that commotion woke up my dad, because before I knew it, we're driving off of the sand back onto the road, flooring it the whole way, only to get the back window smashed in with the creature slamming its 2-fingered hand in the glass screen, sending shards everywhere, even into its own hand. It didn't follow us for much longer, as it had glass shrapnel in its hand. It started to slow down and limp away, leaving blood marks on the back door. We kept driving without looking back, fearing to see it again. Eventually, we had to stop as we caught up with the rest of the family, and we all shared the same expressions on our face and the look of terror glued on. That day is one I'll never forget. My best friend, I'll call her T, and I, L, used to explore the woods around her elementary school when we were just teenagers. There were sidewalk trails around the grounds and play areas, so people were often around. Children playing, dogs being walked, joggers and bikers, like a mini park at times. The day I'm telling you about was different. It was quiet. No one was out. It was cloudy, damp and dark, even with it being early afternoon. But we wanted to go out anyway. We were restless kids. Adventure was totally our middle names. With our backpacks of water bottles and sketchbooks in tow, we cut through the school ground, crossed the creek into the woods. We climbed a slate wall to get into a small hill, dense with trees and undergrowth. The creek was low, so we were able to see the banks through it. Since it was summer, you couldn't walk along them, unless you wanted to guarantee an hour picking ticks off your leg. So, we continue upwards. The top of the hill was maybe 12 feet wide once it leveled out. A steep drop down the creek that looped around the hill on all three sides. We snaked around the trees until we came to the edge, which was mostly a clearing. I walked back along the edge, T warning me to be careful because the dirt was loose and she didn't want me to fall. Taking her warning, I held onto some trees and continued to look over the edge when I stopped cold in my tracks. 10 feet below me, floating in the relatively calm creek water, was a creature. Bigger than a house cat, smaller than a dog, small head, huge paws, and pointy ears, with a relatively long tail, completely skinned with no eyes. I had to take a second look. What? I turned around to find T a few yards away, looking out into where our creek meets a larger creek. Hey, T? I had to repeat twice because my voice caught in my throat. Come here. T trotted over warily, probably seeing the confusion in my face. Without saying a word, I pointed down into the water, the creature still floating lifeless. What? She whispered. What is that? I shrugged. To hell if I knew. It was huge but looked too much like a cat. Surely this was just some cruel animal abuse case, right? L, over here. T's voice was dark and scared. She had walked a few feet ahead of me, following the edge of the hill. Down in the creek were 3 more of these things, varying ever so slightly in size, but all skinned and not proportioned at all like the cats we both were beginning to lose hope that they were. As we walked along the edge, looking for more, we began to notice the mood in the woods had changed. It was quieter. The wind stopped blowing. No birds were chirping or flying around. The water had even become quieter as it flowed over the rocks. We counted 7 total. 7 creatures skinned and dead, 1 without eyes, a few missing paws and tails. The weirdest part being none of them with any ounce of decay on them. I want a closer look. I have to know what these are, I said. T giving me a look and said that she was thinking about it. I didn't hear you say that. But she was also curious. As we made our way back down, we increasingly began to feel like we were being watched, but we pressed on. We made our way through the creek in the direction of the corpses. I'm sure they were right here, I whispered to myself. L! T shouted behind me and grabbed my arm, stopping my next step, which would have been on one of the corpses. 8. A chill went up my spine. I had never felt an emotion as sickening as this in my life. They weren't hairless. They were definitely skinned. No decay. Some missing pieces. We eventually got too freaked out and ran, running faster back towards the school because it felt like we were being glared at and followed. We ran all the way home. We went back the next day, and they were all gone. They didn't wash away because there was no reason for the waters to rise so much to take them. To this day, 5 years later, we still get creeped out when we think about it, and we have never found any answers as to what creature did this. For some background info, I am an 18-year-old male. I live with my dad and 2 siblings and my 2 dogs. Poppy, a black Labrador, cross Staffy, and Missy. Right now, I am on summer break from college, and my mental health hasn't been very good at all. Every night, I have nightmares and wake up several times a night. But this time was different. I had a dream that I was trying to sleep in my bed, but something woke me up. My bedroom door creaked open. Something big and demonic slouched down and entered my room. This creature was tall, with black fur and a white face. It looked like a mixed dog with human. Surprisingly, all I did in my dream was turn away and pull the blanket over my ear, but I could still see the creature as if it had eyes in the back of my head. The creature turned and left my bedroom. I assume it lost interest because it thought I had. As soon as the creature left my bedroom, I woke up. I was spooked and thankful that it was a dream. But then I looked at my door and saw that it was open. I always make sure to keep my door closed, and my door is extremely stiff. You have to kick it to open it. This happened about an hour ago. It is now 6 a.m. I don't really know what this was, but I will update this if anything else happens. I would appreciate any explanation or theories anybody could offer. I believe I have a strange incident worth mentioning that involves the Mothman, but I'm not entirely sure. I'll leave it up to you to put those pieces together. See, my knowledge of the Mothman is very minimal, but I do know that there was something involving a town called Point Pleasant, in which the Mothman appeared on a bridge, and then after, it was cited that the bridge collapsed, or something along those lines. Listen, I've barely done much research, but enough to know that what is basically described is the gist of what happened. The way I would describe it is this being is called to be a bad omen. That relates to the incident that I'm about to tell you about, because it's the only thing that leads me back to believing that this is the same being that I saw. A couple of years back in the wintertime, I was visiting my brother, who didn't live far away from me, and he had become very ill. The doctors were not able to figure out what exactly was wrong with him, and his illness had taken him to such a depth that I had to start taking time off work to seriously help him out. He wasn't married and didn't have any kids, so him and I were really all each other had. Mom and Dad had passed away long ago, and we were still very close. His illness continued to get worse and worse, and he would have random bouts of night terrors, extreme vomiting, deliria, sometimes totally forgetting who he was and where he was at. He would fall unconscious at random times, appearing to have seizures. Blood tests, CT scans, you name it. Every test under the sun doctors ran on him, but nothing would come back conclusive. It was truly baffling. Doctors and nurses could not find anything wrong with him. He even tested for cancer, but came back negative on multiple occasions. Then, he went through a period where he seemed to be surprisingly getting much better, much faster than he was deteriorating. He was regaining his energy and strength like never before, and for the first time in a long while, I was able to be independent. I had visited him a couple times during this, and while he was regaining his strength back, it was at this point as I was leaving the house one evening that I saw what looked to be a tall black bat-like figure perched up on top of his chimney, staring down at me with bright red eyes. I don't know what I was looking at, or if I was having an hallucination or what, but I got out of my truck and I shook my fist at it and told it to get away from my brother. I thought it was a demon, but little would I know that it was truly coming for his life. I screamed at it, I cussed at it, I called it everything under the sun, and it just sat there, looking at me, and then in a flash of light, flew off. I've never felt so angry before. I understand you might consider my reaction crazy, because most people would not have reacted that way. Most people would have been terrified to see what I did. But the overwhelming feeling of this thing coming to prey on my weakest, sickly brother made me sick, even if his condition was drastically improving at the moment. Let me explain. I'm very overprotective over my brother, and always have been. I would find myself in bouts of bravery, even at times where normal people should have been terrified over the course of growing up. That involves high school bullies and other abusive situations between my father, him, and I. He's my flesh and blood, and I'll always love him, even if he is gone and in a better place. I would later on research and find out what it was that was on his chimney, and everything seemed to point to the whole Mothman phenomenon, which I had nothing on or any knowledge about. I do remember reading something about the whole Point Pleasant Bridge and it crashing, and just a bunch of other sightings of people have had in the time being. I think I've mainly brushed it off the time and tried not to think too much about it. I didn't care if I saw a supernatural being or not. I wasn't going to let it do anything to my brother, because honestly, that's the feeling I got from it. As soon as I looked into its eyes, into infinity, I couldn't shake the feeling like it was the Grim Reaper coming for my brother's soul. A few days go by, and I get a call from one of his close friends who's at his house, telling me that his condition has suddenly decreased and he needed to be transported to the hospital ASAP. Of course, I raced over there, doing all I could to take care of my brother, and we called an ambulance. He was taken to the hospital, where he had received great care, but his conditioning kept worsening. About 2 days later, he passed away in the hospital. Even his cause of death was unknown, and the doctors marked it as a natural cause. They conducted an autopsy, but reported nothing abnormal. His death was the hardest thing to ever have happened to me in my life, and I'm still not fully recovered from it. I don't think I ever will. You just don't recover from something like that. The meaning behind me telling you this isn't about the fact that I lost my brother. It's the fact that I want to know what I saw, and if it had anything to do with his sudden passing. You look at the Point Pleasant situation, and it appearing there was like an omen. Is this one of those superstitious situations where if you see the Mothman, something bad is going to happen? That's what I begin to question, and my sanity has soon slipped away. I'm not sure about anything anymore, and no research I can find is truly concrete. I'm just asking you for answers, since you seem to know a lot about this kind of stuff and the paranormal. The only thoughts I can honestly confide in is that my brother is now in a more peaceful state. I don't know what mystery illness he had, or why he died when he did, even though he seemed to be getting better. But he's gone now, and I'm still fighting day after day to accept it. The best thing I could do at this point is to get answers as to what and why. Believe me, I know if I see the Mothman again, he's probably going to be coming back for me, and he ain't going to win so easily. I won't let him. You might think I'm crazy, but I swear on what I say is truth. I do believe that I've been seeing this creature, what many call the Mothman, flying around at night around where I live. To make matters worse, many of my family has seen it too, and they all have their own stories. Of course, everybody's story and situation is different, but mine feels a little more terrifying. I've only ever seen it at night, and it only ever reveals itself by sitting on top of a tree or somewhere on top of my house, waiting for me to exit so it can terrify me. I've shot at it multiple times, but to no avail. Bullets don't even seem to bother this thing, and it never makes a sound. Even as it flies through the air or flaps its wings, nothing. Not even the air around it moving. It resembles that of a human with large wings, kind of like a bat. I've seen its face, and it looks more evil than some of the movies that I've seen on TV. I know deep down in my heart that this thing comes from the pits of hell, and I've done every ritual, every ward, every prayer to try and get rid of it, and nothing works. I don't know why it's stalking me and my family, but it seems intent on getting something that it wants. I just don't know what that is yet. It doesn't appear every night, but it shows itself often just to let me know that it's there. At night sometimes, I'll hear it walking around on my roof, and then it suddenly disappears, just as soon as it appeared. I can't even step outside at night for a cigarette without feeling this stifling thick feeling of something wrong. It's so thick in the air, you can cut it with a knife. I'll always know he's around because of the bitter feeling in my stomach, the uneasiness he gives off. It makes your hair stand up. Nothing can compare to the fear this thing emits. It doesn't attack though, nor has it ever tried to. That's the scariest part. It just waits and watches, as if it's waiting for something. Waiting for the right time to strike, or the right moment to act. It's calculating, its movements, it's strategizing. The way it watches me, watches my family. It's unnerving, and I know it's planning and plotting something. I've gone to pastors, I've gone to healers, I've gone to psychics. Nobody has a concrete answer as to what I'm dealing with. I burn sage and I place wards around my house, but it's like this being doesn't even seem to notice nor care. I fear I will never get rid of it till it finally gets what it wants. I live in the greater Chicago area, all the way out by myself. I'm far enough away from any neighbors that I'm more secluded, and I've even opened up the lines of dialogue between me and my neighbors and have asked them, regardless of them thinking I'm crazy, if they have had any similar experiences. Of course, none of them do, and don't know what I'm talking about. It either makes them a liar, or they are in denial. It makes me feel even worse, because I know whatever this is solely targeting me and my family. Listen, I don't know if you know anything about what I'm going through, but I'm desperate. Maybe it wants my soul. Maybe it wants me dead. I don't know. All I know is that this thing is on a mission, and it's not going to stop until it gets what it wants. I just hope that what it wants isn't me, or any one of my family members.